Today in the Texas Tribune Weekend Insider. Now that the ballots have been counted after the longest primary season in recent Texas history, reporters Jay Root and Aman Batheja sit down to consider winners and losers, upcoming runoffs, the U.S. Senate race, the battle of conservative versus conservative, and whether endorsements really matter.
Anything surprise you about the Senate race?
I think what was most surprising about the Senate race is how much difficulty Dewhurst had convincing people that his record is Perry's record. You know, he's been lieutenant governor since 2002 and has been aligned with Perry on a lot of big initiatives. Perry was widely praised for his record in Texas when he ran for president just a few months ago, and yet Dewhurst got almost none of the credit for that among conservative activists around the state and in D.C.
You know, it always makes me wonder if endorsements really matter too, though. I mean, just because Perry endorsed Dewhurst, you know, I'm not sure, does it say anything about Perry's strength that he wasn't able to help pull Dewhurst over the line?
I think maybe what it says is that Perry can have strength if his endorsements match up with what other people are doing. I think his endorsements aren't as powerful as perhaps Sarah Palin or maybe even Ron Paul to a certain segment of Republican voters. And Perry wasn't able to, Perry's influence wasn't as strong as theirs.
What happens now? I mean, so we go into a July 31st runoff, which, I mean, I don't think we probably have had a late summer runoff, but not in the modern era. I mean, what's the turnout going to be? Do we have any idea?
Turnout is expected to be kind of pathetic, probably less than 5%. And looking back at the past few years, when there's been a runoff in the Republican primary, it's kind of split whether the person who came in first or second in the primary ends up winning the runoff. It really depends on who can get their supporters out. And Cruz seems to have more of the enthusiasm on his side.
I mean, it seems to me this is, you know, we've talked about this before, but this is partially a national trend where the insurgent has been, you know, taking down some of these established figures like Dick Lugar in Indiana. I mean, does that comparison work?
I think to an extent, groups like Club for Growth are really trying to make that comparison, and they're putting money into Cruz and getting national attention by saying Cruz is the next Dick Lugar. It's harder to win a race like that in Texas than it is in a smaller state like Nebraska or Indiana, just because it takes so much more money to compete here. What would you say were some trends you saw in this year's results?
I think that in these crowded primaries, some of the conventional wisdom just went out the door. In a couple of congressional races, some of the candidates who were supposedly favored didn't win. Like, for example, in Congressional District 36, brand new Southeast Texas district, Mike Jackson, former state senator, everybody thought he was going to get in the runoff. He didn't. He came in third. The other trend that I think is unmistakable is that in almost every case, the more conservative candidate won. I mean, obviously, Joe Straus, who is considered to be a moderate, he's a speaker. He had $4 million for a state house race. He crushed Matt Beebe. It wasn't even close. It was 2-1. There was, you know, challenger. They tried to take out Straus in his own district, miserably failed. But Straus, Speaker of the House, lost 3 of his chairmen. And in every case, you know, it's like the conservative, the one who was perceived as the more conservative candidate, as long as they ran a credible campaign, ended up winning. What's really interesting about that is that this last legislative session in 2011 was one of the most conservative sessions you could possibly imagine. They cut education more deeply than they had at least since World War II. The sonogram bill was the toughest sonogram bill probably in the nation. Voter ID, just go down the list of all the conservative things, but then you still have these conservative insurgent challengers that go into these primaries and say, my opponent's not conservative enough, and it worked in many cases. So I think that to me, I think I'd like to see somebody knock me off of that trend. I'm certainly willing to listen, but it seems to me that that's, you know, unmistakable.
And I think that kind of goes back to even Dewhurst's race, where the conservative activists were saying, yes, a lot got done, but it wasn't because of that guy, or it wasn't because of Vicky Truitt or different state reps or state senators. It was saying they kind of went with the flow.
And Cruz portrayed it as a fight between the Tea Party, his sort of Club for Growth Tea Party movement against the establishment. But Rick Perry is supposedly Mr. Tea Party and all of that. So it's really kind of a fight. The whole fight has moved to the right, and it's basically two factions, two kind of Tea Party conservative factions claiming they have the conservative mantle. So to the extent that that moves forward in the legislature in ideological battles over legislation, I think that's something to be watching out for.
And I think in November there actually aren't going to be a lot of competitive races.
We're basically, the nominees that we have now are pretty much going to, or that we will have by July 31st, are pretty much going to, most of them are going to win.